Hare Krishna, I'm Todd Desmond. I'm back with you to speak about the parallels between Plato's Republic and Euripides' tragic play, the Bacchae. I left off in Book 5, which is really where the parallels between these two works of art are most obvious. As King Pentheus believed, the women of his town, who had been possessed by the god Dionysus, were actually, he believed they were engaged in naked orgies on Mount Cithaeron. They were not doing that, but that's what he thought. Similarly, in the Republic, Socrates is convincing his young men to create a city wherein the men and women of the guardian caste, the warrior caste, whom he refers to as dogs, just as the women of Thebes were referred to as hounds and dogs and hunting dogs, will exercise naked together in the gymnasium. The men did exercise naked together in the gymnasium in Athens, and they were mocked by other Greek city-states for that tradition of theirs, making it more subject to mockery. Socrates suggests that the women be allowed into the gymnasium, and they too will now exercise naked with the men. I think even the most egalitarian among us will admit that that probably wouldn't be such a good idea. Naked men and women exercising together is it's a little too there's too many erotic implications. I think it might lead to some embarrassing situations. Nevertheless, Socrates sets this up as one of the crucial parts of his utopian city, which is actually his second utopian city, which he openly calls feverish at the very beginning. The whole point is I am saying he doesn't believe this is actually a just society he's creating. What he's doing is secretly luring the boys who had kidnapped him to tell them what justice is through the tragic play of Euripides' play, the Bacchae, through that sacred pastime of the god, the flute-playing god Dionysus, who had returned to Greece from India. So the young men he's speaking to go along with that very well. The women and the men will exercise naked together. They will fight in the field together against other city-states, and then they continue. And then Socrates says, and in addition to that, we will really have no solution to evils until a philosopher becomes the king, which he said is even more ridiculous and will be laughed at even more heartily than the suggestion that men and women should exercise naked together. It doesn't seem like such a crazy thing for someone to say today. A philosopher should be the king, or at any rate the executive of a nation should be philosophically enlightened as possible. But in Socrates' day, things were different, and philosophy was new. Generally, it was religious tradition that was pointed to for guidance in how to run states. And so some people accuse Socrates of killing the entire religious tradition, the Dionysian religious tradition. Friedrich Nietzsche accused Socrates of doing that, although he played games as well. That's a whole other story. But it is important to mention him because his argument against Socrates in The Birth of Tragedy, his first book, is really the source, I believe, of Plato's argument against of Al Gore's argument against Plato in his book. But that's another issue. I'm returning to the structural parallels between the Republic and Euripides' play. The philosopher will become the king. Now, the young men he's speaking to, naturally, they want to be kings in real life. They were from wealthy families, and they had some potential to be political leaders, although, as I mentioned in a previous video session, at this point in history, where the setting of the Republic is supposed to be taking place, Athens was engaged in a war with Sparta, the Peloponnesian War, and though they hadn't lost yet, they were losing, and eventually they did lose, and subsequently an oligarchy of 30 tyrants was supported by the Spartans to try to overthrow the democracy of Athens. Among some of these tyrants, or the 30 tyrants, were Socrates' pupils. Rightfully so, some of the democratic leaders thought Socrates might have put them up to this and put him on trial, although because of an amnesty that had been declared, they couldn't outright accuse him of that, corrupting these youths. So they accused him of believing in gods of his own invention and corrupting the youth. And he was put to death for those crimes. He was found guilty by a majority, not everybody. They took a vote, and he was put to death. So Paul Marcus was those who had already been killed by those 30 tyrants with whom Socrates was associated. As King Pentheus had been destroyed by his own people, his own women, the women of his town. He was the king, they were his subjects, they'd killed him. Polemarchus had also been killed by some of Socrates' former students. Whether he told them to kill Polemarchus or not, I don't know, but this parallel with Euripides' play makes that a viable suspicion. It complicates Plato, but I also think it gives a much deeper understanding of what Plato was trying to say his God really is. This entire method of portraying his God, showing rather than telling, through a literary game, shows the playful nature of this dangerous God. And the union of all opposites is what this God is. Dionysus, this God, or God, I believe God, the origin of all being, is being described by Plato in this literary method. So the philosopher, he says, must become the king, and then he tells them the cave allegory, which I went over in another video, which I will not go over again now since I've gone over it twice. But in that cave allegory, the prisoner in the cave who sees shadows on the walls released to see the spiritual sun with the eye of the soul, and then you have the just philosopher king by seeing that. I'm going to come back to that cave allegory, but there is no parallel in the Republic of Pentheus being ripped to shreds as he was in the Bacchae. Polemarchus was not ripped to shreds in the Republic, but putting it in its historical context, Polemarchus was subsequently ripped to shreds. I don't know if he was literally ripped to shreds, but he was killed, he was murdered, most likely stabbed since they didn't have guns, repeatedly. And so I'm saying that historical context is itself the parallel between the Republic and the Bacchae. That was Plato's intention. The beginning parallels in the sense that as King Pentheus sent his subjects to arrest Dionysus, Polemarchus sent his slave boy to arrest, in a playful way, Socrates. Then, as Dionysus tricked Pentheus into dressing as a woman to go spy on what he thought would be a naked orgy among men and women on Mount Cithron, similarly in Book 5, and I forgot to mention this previously, Socrates said, oh, let's imagine that we are women in our utopian construction to see where their proper place should be. Should they fight equally with men and exercise naked in the gymnasium with the men? So he not only told them to imagine a naked orgy, he then told them to imagine themselves as women to help them understand how to create this just society. But that parallels what Dionysus did to Pentheus. He had Pentheus dress as a woman and then let him out to his slaughter, put him on the top of a pine tree so he could spy on the Maenads, and then he was ripped to shreds. Socrates tells his boys to imagine their women, and to imagine basically an orgy, this naked exercising of men and women, and including incest. And then he says, you can become the philosopher king. I will have to come back in a moment. I've got this symbol.